update something. All right. I think this is almost ready. Hopefully the internet's a bit slow today, so I'm hoping that we don't have too much problem, but I think we're going up right now. Oh, here we go. All right, so let's go. So guys, how you going today? I'm Jeff. I'm the winemaker from Tractors Vineyard. We run our vineyard all biodynamically. We run sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we use the tractor about 60% less. So that's where our name comes from. You know, we're really trying to be quite a sustainable label. We use special low carbon glass bottles. We've got solar on the winery. We do the biodynamics, of course. I have this ultimate goal that one day I'll take the entire winery off the grid. At the moment, our nighttime energy use is a little bit high for the technologies of the batteries. And so we're not quite there, but we're doing some work with some geothermal people and doing some work with some, there's this new company that's actually converting bio waste into electricity, which is pretty cool. So I'm hoping with some of these new technologies, we'll eventually be able to go completely off the grid, which will be pretty exciting. But let's taste some wines, because that's why we're here. So the first one we're going to taste is our Sauvignon Blanc. And we're pretty much going to work our way down that list until we eventually get to the bottom. I did mention before, so our vineyards, we're located in Barrel in the Southern Highlands. So it's about an hour and a half south of Sydney. It's quite a boutique, cool climate region. And so, you know, cool climate varieties, and we'll get to that when we taste some wines are what do really well here. So Sauvignon Blanc, I'm actually normally not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I find them like really fruity and in your face. And so I make this in what we call a fumé style. And a fumé style is a style that originates out of Bordeaux in France. And it's essentially a Sauvignon Blanc that's fermented with oak. And what that oak does a couple of things. Well, the first thing you notice is when you smell it, you get this little vanilla lift on the nose, and you think, oh, this might be a little bit sweet, but it's not. And that's just that vanilla that you get out of that French oak. The main two things that I love about this style and about what the oak does, one of them is it mellows out all the flavors. So you get all those normal Sauv Blancian intense flavors, but they're just mellowed out by the oak. The other thing that I love is just as that fruit flavor is slowly dipping down at the end, you get this beautiful textural finish. And that texture sort of just hangs around and lingers around. And I'm a massive fan of texture in my wines. I love to be able to smell a wine. I love to be able to taste a wine, but I also love to be able to really feel a wine in my mouth. And that's one of the reasons I love this style. We do a couple of other interesting things when we do a Sauv Blanc. We actually do a double pick. So we harvest half of these grapes at 9 Beaumay. And Beaumay is a sugar level. There's about a million different ways we can measure sugar. There's like Beaumays and bricks and specific gravities and grams per liters and Oechlers, and you know the list goes on. I like to use Beaumay because if I take 1 Beaumay of sugar and I ferment it with yeast, I end up with 1% alcohol. So it's just a really easy 1-for-1 ratio. So we harvest half of these grapes at that 9 Beaumay mark, and then wait probably about 2 weeks. It depends a little bit on the season. Usually about 2 weeks until the second half is around about 13 Beaumay. So 13% alcohol when it's finished fermenting, and this gives me that passion fruit and tropical character in the wine. We then put all those grapes into barrel. That oak mellows out those flavors, gives us that nice texture. And so we end up with a version of a Sauv Blanc that's kind of like a more mellowed out textural version of those big punchy fruity versions that we often see. And I love that style. It's a style that I like to think represents my personality and my winemaking a bit. You know, I kind of think, well, I like to think I'm a kind of mellow, chilled out kind of guy. I know sometimes my wife may disagree with that, but most of the time I think I'm fairly mellow. It's a style that we're starting to see pop up in Australia a bit more. I think as Australian winemakers, we're trying to do something a little bit different and playing around with these other styles. And this is one of the styles that seems to be popping up a bit. If you guys happen to have a cheese in front of you, an Edam or Jarlsberg or one of those sort of softer rind cheeses, they're quite nice with this Sauvignon Blanc. It's a really good example of the style, but it's also a really good example of how cold we are here in the Southern Highlands. And people think, oh, you know, we're only an hour out of Sydney, that we must be similar temperature to Sydney. Well, lowest vineyard is at 500 meters. So we're actually quite a cool region. And some years we actually harvest after Tasmania, you know, so varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, cool climate varieties are what really suit this region. And to get that sort of punchy passion fruit character that you get in that Sauv Blanc, we really are down here. You know, I'm still wearing a jumper. It's definitely not warming up here yet. We get these sunny days and we get all excited. I'm like, yes, finally summer. And but the temperature doesn't get that high. And one of the biggest, I guess, worries at this time of the year, you know, this is a very exciting time of the year for us in the vineyard. We've got bud bursts, so all our little shoots are, you know, a couple of leaves just sticking out at the moment. But we're all nervously chewing our fingernails at this time of the year because we don't want a late frost. And so one of the biggest dangers in these cool climate regions is probably up until early middle of November is the chance of getting a late frost, which can be quite devastating. You know, we've had years where it's wiped out half, if not all, the region before, and especially after last year for the bushfires, we don't want a late frost this year. So it's an exciting time of the year, but a nervous time of year. And all cool climate regions are quite similar. Sitting there, Fumé style Sauvignon Blanc. We are quite known down here for Pinot Gris. I always get people coming into the cellar door asking me, what's the difference between Gris and Grigio? And so I decided that I would make the difference and so we could taste it. So the next one we're going to taste is our Grigio, and then we'll slowly move on to our Gris as well. So Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio are both made from the exact same grape variety. They're both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Pinot Grigio is the Italian way of making it, and Pinot Gris is the French way of making it. So to confuse us all completely, Pinot Gris is the name of the variety, but is also the name of the French style of making that variety. And the first big difference we see between the two is actually the philosophy behind the winemaking. So the Italians, to an extent, we can say the Italians make a wine specifically for a food. That's not 100% true, but they are definitely very conscious of food when they're making the wine. The French, on the other hand, the wine is all about the wine. It doesn't mean that they match any less with food. It just means that the winemakers are approaching the process from two different angles. And so we end up with these two really quite different styles. Warm, a lot of seafood, a lot of maritime climate. And so the Italians are trying to create something that's fresh and crisp and zippy and steely. And so the first thing the Italians do is they harvest it nice and early. So as we ripen a grape, our sugar levels are increasing and our acid levels are decreasing. And so if we want to make something that's quite fresh and zippy, we want to retain that natural acid in the wine. And so we harvest it nice and early when those natural acids are quite high. And so normally a Grigio is around about that 11 to 12% alcohol. The next thing the Italians do, they're not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I squeeze off all the juice into a tank, and then I fill a bucket from the bottom of the tank, and I tip it in the top, and I fill it from the bottom, and I tip it in the top, fill it from the bottom, and I tip it in the top. And I might do that 10 or 20 times until all that juice goes brown from the oxygen. And then I do a really long, slow inclusion and that cold ferment. It helps me, one, stabilize the flavor compounds in a Grigio. It also helps me get crispness and a bit of that green apple character. But one of the main things it does is it creates this steeliness in the palate. And what do I mean by steeliness? Well, if you have a look around your house and you find some stainless steel and give it a lick. And that's what I mean by steeliness. It doesn't really have a flavor, but it kind of has this very clean, metallic-y feeling on the tongue. And that feeling is what we're trying to recreate in these Grigio styles of wine. The problem with these Grigios, and I actually find it's the same with a lot of Italian wines, a lot of Italian styles, is they're actually really hard to taste, especially in a wine tasting scenario or a cellar door scenario. Because they are so designed to go with food, they have heaps of this hidden flavor in them. So when we taste this one now, you know, we get apples and pears and fresh fruit characters in it, but you don't really see any yeastiness or cheesiness or biscuity characters or buttery flavors. You're only really seeing that fruit flavor. One of my favorite matches with this Grigio is actually fresh oysters. And when you match it with a fresh oyster, all of a sudden you get these beautiful, cheesy, yeasty biscuit. Where was that? Because I can't taste it at all now. But when I have it with an oyster, I'm getting all these flavors. Where have those flavors been? And it's a perfect example of what these Italian styles and Grigios do. They have loads of hidden flavor, and they need different foods and different temperatures to release those flavors. So if you were to take that wine and sit it on the desk for the rest of the afternoon, taste it with different foods, taste it at different temperatures, you'll find that the flavor profiles in that wine change quite a lot. And you quite often come back to and go, wow, there's a whole new flavor. Oh, and another one, and another one. And it's what these wines do. But what it makes is really hard, because when we're looking at this wine in a wine tasting, we're seeing that second, the snippet of that wine in that second. And so quite often another wine will overpower them in a wine tasting scenario. And what we might do is actually jump over to our Gris, because it is a really good example of the difference, and it makes it a bit easier for me to explain these hidden flavors that I'm trying to explain in the Grigio. So that's a Grigio, nice, fresh, zippy sort of style, really good match of seafood, more that non-oily seafood like whiting and that sort of thing. It's a good match with a Manchego or one of those harder rind cheeses. I find it's quite nice with. But good way to remember, Italians always in a hurry, so they're the first people to harvest the grape. So you get this nice, fresh, crisp sort of style of wine. Pinot Gris. So if we think about where in France most of the Pinot Gris is grown, most of it is grown in Alsace, which is on the French-German. So it's quite a cool region. The French winemakers, the wine is all about the wine. And so they're trying to create something that's big and round and voluptuous. And they harvest it a lot later. So they let that ripeness, those flavors ripen, which fleshes them out a bit. But it also, that higher alcohol gives you now a bit more mouthfeel and sort of warmth in the mouth. So the French are usually harvesting around about 13 to 14 Beaumet, 13, 14. And as a result, the first thing you notice is that color difference. It's got a real sort of bronzy color to it, and sometimes it even has a little bit of a pinky tinge. And that comes from that ripeness level, because Pinot Gris is a really interesting grape variety. It's one of the only white grape varieties in the world that, when it gets super ripe, starts turning red. And so when we get to sort of high 12s, early 13s, the berries on the bunch the skins of those berries start going pink. And it's actually where the name comes from. So if I get all these pink berries and they're sitting on a bunch, and then that bunch is sitting out in the vineyard, they get a light dusting on the outside of them. And from a distance, those bunches look gray. And the French word for gray is gris. So Pinot, because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and Gris because the bunches look gray on the grapevine. Now, the Italians, they never really get that color in the wine because they're harvesting it a lot earlier. You don't get that color development at all. And so you normally get that normal white wine sort of yellowy, greeny color to a Grigio. Because the French are letting it ripen a lot more, we're getting that grayy and pinky color coming through to the grapes and that color development. And so a traditional French style Gris usually always has that bronzy color to it. And here in Australia, with our warmer temperatures, particularly in warmer regions, that bronzy color can actually come through as a bit of a pinky tinge as well. And so that's one of the first big differences we see with these wines. The next thing you notice, if you look really carefully at your glass, sort of up here, you end up with this ring of clear liquid, which is then dribbling back down into the wine. And we call this the legs of the wine. And what it is everything that's volatile. So everything that evaporates at room temperature evaporates out of that wine. It condensates on the glass, and then it dribbles back down into the wine. Now, this is predominantly alcohol. So the reason we don't see this as much in the Grigio is because the alcohol is only 11, 12%. But because in the Gris, we've got that 13 to 14% alcohol, we definitely really obviously see that line of legs around that glass. And this alcohol does something really interesting. If you give your wine a little bit of a swirl and a good smell, you would probably agree with me that Gris, it appears a lot more aromatic. Seems like there's a lot of aroma jumping out of that glass. The interesting thing is, if I was to scientifically analyze the aroma compounds of the Grigio and the aroma compounds of the Gris actually has loads less than the Grigio. The Grigio has heaps more. And what's happening is, as that alcohol is evaporating out of the wine, it's grabbing onto all the other aroma compounds with it, and it pulls it out with it. So when we smell that wine, we're getting hit with all the aroma compounds all at once. If you will take the Gris and sit it on your table and try it with different foods and try it at different temperatures, it really wouldn't change that much. What we see is what we get. Whereas with the Grigio, there's all these hidden flavors. And this is one of the biggest differences between the two. One of the reason that we have this and we get this difference is because we don't actually taste these flavors. So we're not tasting a pear. We're not tasting a peach. We're actually smelling them. So when we eat a peach, for example, as we chew it and swallow it, some of the aroma compounds become airborne, and we detect it in the nasal passage. And I'm sure, as kids, you've done that thing where you block your nose and you eat something and so you can't taste it. Well, what we're doing is we're stopping the airflow through the nasal passage. And so we're not getting any of those aroma compounds up there. And so in our head, we're not tasting the wine, but we're actually not smelling the wine. So for us to be able to taste the flavor, it needs to be airborne. In the case of the Gree, everything is made airborne by that alcohol. And so we see it all at once or taste it all at once. In the case of the Grigio, one, because the alcohol is lower, but also because of that long, slow, cold ferment. It helps me stabilize a lot of those aromatic compounds. We don't have anywhere near as many compounds aromatic. So at the first instant, we're only seeing that pear and apple. So to make everything else aromatic, we need a change in temperature or a change in chemical structure of the wine to make, when I have it with an oyster changes the chemical structure of the wine. And so all of a sudden it starts releasing those nice yeasty, cheesy characters. And different foods will release different characters out of the Grigio. One of the biggest differences between the two, you know, Brie is, hey, look at me. Look at all the flavors I've got to show you. Whereas Grigio is a bit more shy and reserved. And it's only showing you one thing at a time. The next big thing we notice between the two when we taste this Brie, it's big, it's round, it's voluptuous. And one of the key things we're looking for is this, it's kind of got an oily character to it, like an oiliness, like a viscosity. And that oiliness is actually from a glycerol. So when I take a grape and I ferment it at a really warm temperature, I create glycerols, and these glycerols give me this beautiful mouthfeel. The problem with warm ferments is they blow off all of our aroma compounds. And so to try and counteract that, we do everything under carbon dioxide cover. And so we don't let oxygen near the Gree style at all and try and trap it in a little bit. And this is one of those balancing acts as a winemaker we're always playing. Nice cold ferments give us beautiful aroma compounds, but not much mouthfeel. Nice warm ferments give us things like Chardonnay and other varieties. We're playing this balancing act the entire time. With Grigios and Grees, it's easy because we created two different styles. We've got one Italian, harvesting early, cold ferment, lots of oxygen, and that's our aromatic zippy style. Then we've got the French, harvesting late, no oxygen at all, warmer ferment, and that's our more viscous, mouthfeely style. Now, these two wines are from the exact same vineyard, exact same block, and the only difference is their harvest dates and the winemaking techniques. It's a really good example on how the winemaker and the viticulturist can really affect that final flavor in the wine. Now, I've made these at the two ends of the spectrum. So the Grigio is quite a traditional Grigio, and the Gree is quite a traditional Gree. But you can imagine in reality, you've got all the variations in between, and then this funny gray area. And so that's why there's sometimes a little bit of confusion around Grigios and Grees, is because of all that variation that we do have. As is, I can actually do a poll, so I can see who likes what, because I love seeing who likes what. When I get couples into the cellar door, they usually disagree over which one they like. Usually one of them likes Grigio and one of them likes Gree. But that's fine by me, because it means I end up selling them 2 bottles instead of 1. So I've got no problem if they disagree at all. So that's Grees and Grigios. I actually, the Gree I don't drink with cheese that much. No reason for that at all, because I know it would go very well with cheese. I usually end up having it with sashimi. For some reason, it does this really crazy thing where it makes the wasabi that I have with my sashimi seem quite sweet. And so I love that food match. Grees and Grigios are really great varieties to remember for spicy food. You know how it's really hard to get a match of wine for a spicy food? These are my go-to. If I'm having like Thai and spicy, I'll go the Grigio. If I'm having something like Indian, something that's a bit more round and I guess robust and spicy, I'll go the Gree. And they're just really good ones to remember. For some reason, they can just handle that spiciness. And look at that, 47% Gris, 53% Grigio. As I said, half. And it's quite funny. Quite often, well, these must be popular because quite often we get the same, a couple of people coming back and doing it a few times. And depending on what they're matching it with, you know, if you've got a nice cheese board and meats and a lot of food in front of you, quite often if you're munching on those whilst you're tasting the Grigio, you'll probably pick the Grigio over the Gris. But if you've just got the wines in front of you, then usually people pick the Gris over the Grigio. So it's really interesting to see how people change as well. So that's our Grand Grigio. What about Chardonnays? Do we have many Chardonnay drinkers on today? This is another one of those questions I love asking, because it's Chardonnay is one of those wines that people seem to either love or hate. You know, on average, normally I probably get about 80% of people saying no and about 20% of people saying yes. And we're sort of wavering backwards and forwards a little bit today, so we'll see what it comes out with. The funny thing is that even though 20% of people say yes, it's still our biggest selling white variety in Australia and in the cellar door. And so those 20% of people must do a lot of wine drinking, because it's quite funny. Today, we're fairly close today. We're about 60% no and 40% yes, so pretty close. Which is good, which is exciting for me, because one of the things that I have, I guess, is one of my secret side things. I need a hat that says it. I need a hat that's going to say, "Make Chardonnay cool again," because this is one of my little passions, is making Chardonnay cool again. So it's exciting to see that my numbers are getting better the more of these meetings I'm doing. I think that Australia as a whole is making some of the best Chardonnays we've ever made. And the problem is there's all these other cool varieties that we're talking about. We're not really talking about Chardonnays as much. And so this is why I want to make Chardonnay cool again, is because I think we are making great styles. You know, and we've been through, I think part of this reason people say they don't drink Chardonnay is to do with the history. You know, we've been through this evolution of, in the 70s and 80s, we had these super oaky, super like buttery Chardonnays. And then sort of late 90s, early 2000s, we had these really unoaked, fruity Chardonnays. And we all have this memory of something that's too oaky or too buttery or too Chardonnay or too fruity, or not oaky enough or not buttery enough or not fruity enough. And we're all a bit, you know, unsure about Chardonnay. For me personally, Chardonnay is all about balance. So I want to see oakiness, I want to see butteriness, I want to see fruitiness, but I don't want any one of those flavors to overpower the other flavor. And so when you taste this Chardonnay, you go through that evolution. You know, it starts off with this nice little bit of vanilla-y oak. You then get a lick of butteriness before it goes into mangoes and grapefruits and that citrusy finish to it. But the key for me is balance. And so what I want to see is all of those flavors in about the same intensity level. So this wine for me does that. It sort of goes oaky, buttery, mangoey, grapefruity, citrusy. It's not going oaky, buttery, mangoey. And that's what I'm looking for in a Chardonnay, is that nice balance. And I don't use any new oak. I find the first year of oak is just a bit splintery and overpowering, and so I don't often use new oak. I use a little bit of malolactic fermentation, which gives us that nice butteriness. So that's something that a lot of you may not realize. Those buttery flavors that we get in Chardonnay, they actually come from a second ferment. So everything gets fermented with yeast, and that yeast takes the sugar and makes the alcohol. So it's probably the most important part of the process, because that's what makes our alcohol. And we get a bit of flavor development. Our Chardonnays and our reds go through a secondary fermentation. It's a bacterial fermentation. And this bacteria takes the malic acid, which is the same acid that you find in an apple, and it converts it to lactic acid, which is the same acid that you find in milk. So it's a softer acid. And a byproduct of this second ferment are these buttery flavors we see in Chardonnay. And so we put all of this through malolactic fermentation, but we use some quite different strains of bacteria so that we only get a little bit of that butteriness and not too much of that butteriness. It then eases into those nice fruity flavors at the end. And that balance again is what I think is key. And we're seeing so many great examples of that coming out. And I don't care if a Chardonnay is oaky, as long as that buttery and fruity characters are about the same intensity. So no matter where that oakiness is and where that butteriness is and where that fruity character is, I just like to see them all about in balance. Someone's asked how long would sell a Chardonnay for. I love old Chardonnay. So Chardonnays, Rieslings, and Semillons are my three favorite white wines to age. And I love them when they get really old. You start getting this really nice sort of toasty, honey toasty character to Chardonnay. So I'm finding, well, at the moment, the oldest Chardonnay that we've got under our Tractus label is 2012. And that is still easily got at least 10 years in it. It's only just starting to get some of those toasty characters, and there's still plenty of fruit there to really pull it off. So, you know, I'd easily be saying this Chardonnay would easily give us another 15, if not 20 years. I guess the thing is, what happens is we slowly over time drop that fruit level. So we just want to be able to have some of that fruit there to keep that nice toasty character in balance when we're aging a Chardonnay. And one of the best things that we have these days is the invention of the screw cap. And that really helps us retain that fruit character quite well. And so, yeah, I think it's really going to help with aging properties as well. If you happen to have a Brie in front of you, a Brie is a great match with this Chardonnay. I find it just, I love that it doesn't matter how creamy your Brie is. So if you have a super creamy fromage dauphinoise, those buttery mango notes of the Chardonnay come right up here and they match it. If I only have a lightly creamy Brie, those buttery and mango notes of the Chardonnay, they only come to here. And I just think it's really cool that no matter where your Brie is, that Chardonnay just matches it perfectly. And I think it's a really cool match. And of course, traditionally, Chardonnay is a great match for those more oily fish like salmon and things like lobster and crab and those sort of dishes as well. So yeah, it's a good balanced Chardonnay. I hope that we're making Chardonnay cool again. I see someone says it's already cool, and you're the third person that's told me that this week. So I'm getting really excited. I reckon Chardonnay's on its way back. I've been waiting for a long time, and I feel there's a resurgence here in Chardonnay, which will be great because I think we're making some great Chardonnay around Australia nowadays. You know, we're so lucky in every state. There's a number of great regions that are making good Chardonnays. Next one on our list today is our semi-dry Riesling, and we do a couple of Rieslings. We do a dry Riesling and we do a semi-dry Riesling. And I was tossing up which one to include in the tasting, and I thought, you know, we actually get to see a lot of really great examples of dry Riesling in Australia. What we don't get to see as often are good examples of those beautiful German style, sweeter style Rieslings. And part of the problem is that most of the sweet wines I find in Australia are usually made by bigger companies. And if I'm consulting to a big company and I'm making a batch of Riesling for them that they want sweet, for example, and I'm fermenting 20,000 liters, the ferment in 20,000 liters is so strong, you just can't stop it. It just keeps going and going. It's like me standing in front of a semi-trailer like that trying to stop it. It's just not going to happen. And so what we do is we ferment it dry, and then we back out our sweetness. And when we're back adding a sweetness, we end up with a slightly caramelized, sugary character to the sweetness rather than a fresh character to the sweetness. So when we're making a sweeter Riesling in a more traditional, or any sweet wine really, in a more traditional German or European style, we can only do it in small batches. So we can only do, say, 3,000 to 5,000 liters at any one time. We start it fermenting. And when the sweetness level is where we want it, we chill it and filter it and stop the ferment. And what that does is it means we're retaining the natural sweetness from the grape rather than needing to add sweetness. And when you do that, you end up with a more juicy, lush sort of sweetness. And that's because the types of sugars and the percentage of those different types of sugars and the types of acids and the percentage of those different types of acids, the way they work in grapes gives us that really juicy, fresh sort of character. It's kind of like, you know, when you bite into an apple, the apple is really quite fresh, but an apple actually has quite a high level of sweetness. But because of the types of sugars and types of acids in an apple, it tastes fresh. And it's the exact same with grapes. If you can retain that natural sweetness in the grape, you end up with a wine that, like this, has that more juicy, lush sweetness. Now, this is quite a sweet Riesling. So in the list of, I guess, sweetness levels in Germany, this is, you know, a level before it's classified as a dessert wine. So it's still a table wine. And I wanted to make it with quite a high sweetness level to demonstrate how sweet wines can be quite juicy and lush. And I think this is a good example of that. You know, we see a wine like that that's a bit sweet. And in Australia, we are so used to those sweetness levels being caramelized and sugary, we immediately want to put a style like that towards dessert or towards cheese at the end of a meal. Personally, because of this freshness and juiciness, I think on a really nice warm day, nicely chilled, this wine is a great aperitif. Matched with some antipasta or a really nice like Waldorf salad or something like that. You know, it can handle a bit of that blue cheese in there. I think that's a great way to start a meal. Nice palate cleanser at the beginning of a meal, a couple of glasses of that chilled before you move into the next dish and the next wine. So I do think it's a great example of that German style that we really, you know, we don't get to see as often here in Australia. You know, I'm not really sure why. Yes, there is, from a boutique winemaker's perspective, there is a lot of challenges and difficulties making a sweeter wine, you know, especially with stability after you've bottled the wine. But I think that there's some good examples of what we can do with sweet wines. So that's our last white for today. I don't know about you guys. There's been a bit of sun out today, so I am enjoying a white. But for the last few months, I definitely have not been. It's been freezing down here. You know, we've had snow. I've had the fire cranking and the heaters on. So it has definitely been red wine weather. But before we move into the red wine, I'll launch a little poll of who was everyone's favorite whites. But yeah, so the past month, definitely a lot of red wines in front of fires here, that's for sure. So the first red we're going to look at when we get to the reds is going to be our Lost Flock. Now, you don't, if you want to change glasses, you're welcome to, but you don't need to. I have made this so that the following wine is always a little bit more powerful and fruity than the previous wine. And so that way we can just move on. Don't have to worry about rinsing out our glasses or changing glasses. So you don't have to change the glasses. Oh, look at this. Chardonnay is definitely on its comeback. The winning wine today is our Chardonnay, 44%, and then the rest is spread a bit between the others. So, and virtual tastings I'm doing, the better percentages that Chardonnay is getting. So I'm going to keep doing them. So let's move on to our reds now. And as I said, the first red we're going to taste is our Lost Flock. I was sitting at home and I was drinking a big Barossa red, and I love them. You know, they've got that velvety tannin those chocolates and those raspberries. And I just find sometimes they're a little bit heavy. And so I wanted to make a wine that had all those nice velvety tannins and chocolates and raspberries, but was made in a more cool climate, delicate style, so that I could sit in front of the fire and drink the bottle. Not that I'm telling anyone to drink a bottle by themselves, but that may have been a little bit of inspiration behind this wine. And so when I come up with this blend, it's essentially a GSM. So Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre, but I also have a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot. And so this is just my soft, everyday, easy drinking red. It's got those nice velvety tannins, those nice chocolate notes, that lingering raspberry at the end, but in that nice, delicate style. It's one of the wines I drink the most of. It's a little bit by default. Now, do you remember back in the days when we were allowed to have dinner parties? Back in those days, I always grabbed a blend because someone likes Shiraz and someone likes Merlot and someone likes Grenache. Take a blend, everyone can find a flavor in that wine that they like. And so that's why I usually take a blend. It's a wine that's really special to us. And the main reason for that is actually because of the name, the Lost Flop. So when you choose to go biodynamic or organic, you're doing it from a really philosophical point of view. Because if I was to make a Shiraz, for example, and put it in a bottle shop, it might have a value of, say, $30. If I was to make a biodynamic or organic Shiraz and put it in a bottle shop, it still really only has a value of $30. Like, I don't get any increase in value for being biodynamic or organic. It's starting to change a little bit, but we're not really there yet. The problem with being biodynamic or organic is it's a lot more expensive way to grow the grapes. And the biggest expense for us is actually managing the grass, because if you are an industrial vineyard, it's easy. You just herbicide the grass, or you herbicide little strips underneath the grapevines, and then all you have to do is mow in between. So it's quite easy to manage the grass. For biodynamics and organics, we don't want a herbicide. And so we spend a lot of time and money cultivating and mulching and whippersnipping and managing this grass. So it comes quite expensive. And our region is quite a fertile region. And so grass grows a lot here. And so it really is one of our biggest expenses. In 2013, we had a caterpillar problem on our vineyard. And the biodynamic philosophy says that if you have insect problems on your land, it's because you don't have enough animals. And so we started experimenting with sheep. And first, I tried Dorpers. I thought Dorpers, they'll be perfect. You know, they're easy, fairly easy to look after. They're wool sheds, so you don't need to worry about shearing. So I thought, yep, Dorper, perfect. So we've got these Dorpers. Well, a Dorper is pretty much like a goat, and they ate half the vineyard. And so it was an absolute failure of an experiment, that one. I grew up on a sheep farm. I grew up on a merino farm. And merinos are what we call grazing sheep. So a Dorper is a browsing sheep, which means they look everywhere for food, and when they find it, they eat it. A merino is a grazing sheep, so they only look inside their grazing zone for food, and they don't look outside of their grazing zone until they've eaten all their food in their grazing zone. So the merinos, they sort of worked. The grapevine sat here, which was outside of their grazing zone. The bunches hung down just inside their grazing zone. And what we did is we ran 2 electrical wires underneath the bunches, and that stopped the sheep from eating the grapes. The problem this year was that when the power went out for 2 hours, it's amazing how many grapes a merino can eat in 2 hours. So we lost a lot of grapes that year, but we were getting closer. Eventually, we found a rare breed of sheep called a Hampshire Down. They're breed from the UK. You can sort of see them in my picture in the background there. They're a wool and a meat sheep. But the biggest difference, they're a grazer, which is the same as a merino. But the biggest difference between a Hampshire Down and a merino, a Hampshire Down is 2 inches shorter. And so with the Merino, the bunches were inside the grazing zone. With the Hampshire Downs, the bunches were outside of the grazing zone. So what it means is we can run the sheep underneath the vineyard for the entire growing season. So this has solved our caterpillar problem. And I don't know why I didn't think about it at the time. I was so obsessed with fixing this caterpillar problem. But guess what? Sheep eat grass. And so the most expensive part of running our vineyard is now done for free by the sheep. And so they've taken something that is a fundamental decision and expensive way to, like a philosophical decision, expensive way to run a vineyard, and converted it into something that it's probably about the same as a normal a cost of a vineyard, normal industrial vineyard now with the sheep. But these Hampshire Downs are really cool. They're better than a Merino or Dorper for a number of reasons. And another one of the reasons is Merinos and Dorpers flock. And so you end up with these sheep camps where there's all the manure in one spot and there's no grass in that spot, and they follow each other through the vineyard. So you end up with these tracts of compaction. Hampshire Downs are what we call roaming sheep. And so they spread out beautifully around the vineyard. And great. So we don't have any of these compaction problems. We don't have any of these Merino problems. So it's great for the vineyard. It's an absolute nightmare when I go to shear, because there's always one sheep wandering somewhere that I always miss. And so I always end up with one woolly sheep wandering around the vineyard. But it reminded me, when I make this wine, I stack all the Shiraz barrels in one stack, and all the Merlot barrels in one stack, and all the Grenache barrels in one stack. And those stacks were scattered all over the winery. And it reminded me of the sheep being scattered all over the vineyard. And so that's my very long story on why we call this wine the Lost Flock. But the sheep are super fundamental in everything we do now. We have really honed our skills down on the sheep, and there's a number of other activities that we do with the sheep on the vineyard that we normally pay humans to do. And so we actually find now with the sheep, our biodynamic vineyards are far, far cheaper to run than even an industrial vineyard. So they really have changed it for us. They're part of the reason we're so sustainable. You know, they're saving us 60% use in the tractor because of the regenerative way the sheep enable us to manage the pasture. It means that we're actually sequestering a lot more carbon into our soils, and which means our soils are a lot healthier, which is a lot better for the environment and a lot more sustainable. So they really are quite important to us. I could rabbit on for the rest of the afternoon about sheep and regenerative agriculture, but we're here to taste wine, so I'm not going to. But that's our Lost Flock. Someone mentioned about getting spice on it. Absolutely, because it does have a bit of Shiraz in there, and we use cool climate Shiraz. I do definitely get a little bit of spice in there as well, that little bit of a white peppery edge from the Shiraz for sure. So that's our Lost Flock. It's a wine that I drink a lot of, but it's not my favorite wine. And I know as a parent, you're not meant to have your favorite child, but secretly, the next wine we're going to taste is my secret favorite child, and that's our Reserve Pinot. Now, our Reserve Pinot, I only make this about once in every 5 years. Every other year, we make a Pinot that is more in line with what we used to here in Australia, those very delicate style Pinots. Like, I find them beautiful, you know. They always remind me of ballerinas. They're kind of complex and interesting, but at the same time very delicate on the palate. And you know, and they always show those beautiful bright red fruit characters, and I love those styles. What we don't get to taste so often in Australia are those old school funky Burgundian styles. And so when we do when the conditions are right and we do our Reserve Pinot, that's how we do it. Loads of whole bunches, loads of stems. When it first goes in a bottle, it's undrinkable. It's bitter and resiny and stemsy, and it actually takes about 4 years to really settle down in bottle. And if any of you have been lucky enough to travel through Burgundy in France, you'll know that you can't really buy a Pinot from a cellar door over there that's under about 3 or 4 years old. And that's because they use that same techniques as we're using this wine here. it creates a wine that's designed to age. This wine is definitely going to age and age and age and age and age. We'll probably stop selling it and do some museum releases to our club members eventually, because I want to be able to experience old wines with definitely some of our club members and as many other people as we can. It's a style that I love. You know, I find that we traditionally match those delicate Pinots with duck and pheasant, but I find these bigger, funkier styles go really well with like venison and kangaroo. Actually, you know, just lightly barbecued kangaroo, I think is a really nice match with this wine as well. I love it. My accountant hates it. You know, we spend all this money making it, and then I put it into storage for 4 years before we sell it. So he hates it, but I love it. So he doesn't get a say in it. But it produces these big funky styles. You may notice a little bit of cloudiness in it. This is one of our more natural wines. It's all unfiltered. It's all vegan. It's very old school winemaking techniques that create these big funky wines that are going to age and age and age. And, you know, we're getting those mushrooms and those cigar box characters and those forest floor characters, those really funky flavors that we see in these styles a lot more. And, you know, it is quite a big style. With, you know, to be tasting a Pinot second in a red lineup, especially against the GSM, is quite unheard of. And it's because of that really bigger, funkier style. And I love that style. All of our wines up until now, including the Pinot, I use quite European techniques. I mentioned how I love texture to my wines. And to get that texture, I need to use some more European techniques to really get that texture in our wines. The problem with those techniques is when I put the wines into bottle, I find they take about 18 to 24 months to really settle down before we're ready to release them. If I'm using more contemporary Australian techniques, I make these beautiful, delicate, fresh, fruity style of wine. Yeah, they have a little bit less texture, but I can put them into bottle and they're ready to sell within a couple of months. And so the next wine, which is our Shiraz, is made using those more Australian contemporary techniques. And one of the reasons, well, there's a number of reasons why I wanted to do that. You know, one of the reasons I want to do a Shiraz was one of the first jobs I ever had when I left school was working for a famous winery called Clonakilla in Canberra. And I spent 3 years working with them, and they really instilled a love of winemaking in me because, you know, they're such wonderful people and friendly people that they really instilled this love in me. They instilled this passion about Shiraz because they are famous for their cool climate Shiraz. And so I had to do a Shiraz. Shiraz is famous around the world. I mean, Australia is famous around the world because of Shiraz. It's one of the first varieties that we were recognized around the world for. And so I really wanted to do a Shiraz in our lineup, and I really wanted to make it in a really traditional Australian way. And the funny thing is that I've spent 24 years experimenting with Shiraz, and I've tried these like old school Rhone Valley, really stemsy techniques. And I've tried these really cutting edge, sort of cold macerated, cool climatey Californian techniques. And the funny thing about Australian Shiraz, it just doesn't want to be fiddled with. It just wants to be left alone. And so the most easy hands-off winemaking that we do is with our Shiraz, but it works every single time. We de-stem it, it ferments without their stems for 2 weeks. It goes in winemaking, but it just works. And that creates these beautiful, cool climate Shirazes. And one of the things I love about these Australian cool climate Shiraz is the structure. So when you have a sip of that wine, think about where that tannin and that furriness is on your tongue. And you get right down the middle of the tongue, you get this beautiful line of tannin. And that tannin creates structure around the wine. And so if you think about a warm climate Shiraz, you have all this complex, interesting fruit, and it just sort of goes, there you go, and gives it to you. It's like, whoa, amazing, but all at once. Cool climate Shiraz, they have all this complex, interesting fruit, but because of this beautiful structure, just sort of delicately hands you the flavors. Just keeps handing them to you. rather than throwing it all at you, it's just handing it to you nicely. And that's the thing that I love about Cool Climate Shiraz. It's the thing that I'm really looking for when I'm looking for fruit. So for me, Canberra, Young, and Heathcote are the three regions that consistently give you that beautiful structure. And so that's why we work really closely with some growers in Young, and that's where we get our Shiraz from. So you'll notice we have a couple of series. We've got our Sustainable series and we've got our Creators series. So our Sustainable series is 100% of our biodynamic vineyards, and our Creators series is not. So in the case of the Shiraz, way too cold in the Southern Highlands to grow Shiraz, and so we work close with some growers in Young, and that's where we get the fruit from, and that's why it goes under our Creators series. So we really wanted to define that Sustainable series is off our biodynamic box and Creators series is not. Someone's asking about cellaring the Shiraz. Um, I, I'm surprised, you know, when I sometimes and they need more structure, but after 24 years of drinking and making these styles, they age way better than I expect. They always seem to, they go through probably at about, what year are we now? Probably at about 6-7 years. They do sometimes go through a little bit of a dry dip, but then all of a sudden you get these beautiful sweet tannins coming out in them again. And so I'm finding, you know, I'm drinking at the moment. I'm just seeing some of the ones that are hiding on the shelf over there. That's about 12. So they're about 8 to 10 years old now, and they easily have another 10 years in them. And so this Shiraz, I would be very confident to say, if you're patient and can wait 20 years, it will easily last 20 years. But if you're like me, or if you're like 96% of the world, 96% of wines are drunk within 24 hours of being purchased. There's only 4% of people that age wines. And I'm not very good at it. I mentioned a couple because I happen to have them there, but I've got this great cellar behind me, and I fill up wine and I have a dinner party and I drink it all. So the best thing of COVID is my cellar is almost 12 months old now because we haven't been having dinner parties. So there's always a silver lining. So that's our Shiraz. I love that delicate, cool climate Australian Shiraz style. If you drink Australian Shirazes, this is exactly what you'd expect. It really is a very typical cool climate Australian Shiraz. I made it that way. You know, we've just kicked off these virtual tastings in America, and I love showing this Shiraz because I feel that it really represents Australian cool climate Shiraz. And it's my post-COVID dinner party wine because I've decided I usually don't take a Shiraz to a dinner party because I usually find there's a couple of people that really don't like the spiciness in Shiraz. And so that's why I usually go with the Lost Flock. But I actually find that the spiciness in this is really delicate. And so I've decided that it's not too spicy, and I'm definitely going to be taking it to dinner parties when I'm allowed to have dinner parties again. So we've got two more wines to end on. And these are two really interesting wines. The first one we're going to look at is our post-Mac Cabernet Sauvignon. And I was at uni, and there was about 6 people doing the uni degree with me when I went through winemaking. And then 2 years after me, there was about 200 people. So I became a winemaker before it was cool to be a winemaker. But what it meant was I got to try some amazing wines, because Nick Bulliard, who's one of the masters of wine, it meant he could just grab a bottle from his cellar, bring it in, 6 of us could taste it. When there was 200 people, he couldn't just bring in a bottle because he need to make sure he had enough wine for 200 people. So I got to try some awesome wines. And Nick tells this fantastic story where he was walking down the street of Adelaide, and he walked past this old pub that was being renovated. And there's a skip bin out the front of the pub, and he just happened to glance in the skip bin. He's like, oh, look, there's a bottle of wine in there. And so he's jumped in, he's grabbed out this bottle of wine, he brought it into uni, and we opened it and tasted it. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill vineyard is the original Penfolds vineyard in Adelaide. It was a 46-year-old wine, and it was amazing. And ever since that day, I have been obsessed with making a wine that's going to age 50 to 100 years. And when we look around the world at who's famous for making these red wines that age 50 to 100 years, these delicate reds that just age and age and age. And the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And so the people from Bordeaux, the Bordelais created this technique that they call post-ferment maceration. And that's what we use in this wine. And what it is when we're making a red wine, a lot of people don't realize, but if I take a grape and I squeeze a red grape, the juice and the pulp is actually white. So to create a red wine, I need to extract all that color from the skins. And so what I do is I ferment that wine with the skins. And that ferment process takes about probably 3 or 4 weeks. If I then leave that wine sitting with the skins after the fermentation's finished, it's called post-ferment maceration. In Australia, we play around with 1-2 weeks to 1-2 months. In Bordeaux, they routinely leave it 12 to 18 months. And what this does is it solves 2 problems that we have when we're aging a wine. The first problem is our fruit level. So imagine I have a wine, a normal wine might have a fruit level here. And as we age that wine, the fruit level is slowly dropping and the savory level is slowly coming up. And the premium drinking is about here when they're about the same. And that might be 10, 20 years. So if I want to get to 50 years, I need to start with a huge amount of stable fruit so that when it levels out, it's about here. And that's about 50 to 100 years. So that's my first problem when I'm aging a wine. My second problem is a structural problem. So, you know, when you have a really young Cabernet, it has those sort of chalky, edgy tannins. They like stick to the inside of your tongue and I feel like they're shriveling up your tongue a bit. Well, those short, edgy tannins are short chains. And when you age a bottle of wine, those short chains join together into a long chain, and a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So it's one of the good things that's happening when we age a bottle of wine. So imagine I've got a bottle of wine and I've got 100 short tannins in there. And those 100 short tannins join together into 50 long tannins, which join together into 25 really long tannins. So I've got 25 of these fresh, juicy, velvety, sweet, beautiful tannins. The problem is 25 is not enough. And so the whole structure of that wine falls apart. And it goes through a process we call cracking up. And you end up with this acidy zigzag through the middle of the tongue. So this process solves these problems. Imagine you've got a tank of wine sitting there and it's full with skins and seeds and stems for a really long period of time. So I've got thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around that tank, and it forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle that wine, I'm bottling it with 100 long stable tannins rather than 100 short unstable tannins. And so that's how we solve that structural problem to the wine. The fruit problem, I have no idea how the French figured this out. When you use this technique, at no stage when you're using this technique, does the wine taste fruity. And I swear it must have been some crazy French winemaker. It's gone out there, made all this wine, pressed it off into barrel, come back 12 months later, and he's like, oh, sacre bleu, I forgot a tank. And he's pressed off that tank 12 months later and put it in a barrel and a bottle. And all of a sudden, when he tastes it in bottles, like, wow, this is amazing. It's 10 times more fruity than everything else, because you really do not taste the fruit. And I remember it would have been about that, probably 3-month mark. At about 3 months, went out to the tank, I took a sample, I smelt it, and I tasted it, and I thought, oh my God, I've completely ruined this wine. It tastes absolutely disgusting. And I called some winemaking friends and some mentors in the industry. I'm like, oh my God, I've used this technique before. What do you think? What happened? And they all said the same thing. They all said, yeah, we tried that technique. When we got to 3 months, it tasted so terrible that we pressed it off. We put it into oak. Everyone in Australia is saying, don't worry, press it off and you'll be able to save this wine. I've got everyone in France saying, no, no, got to leave it 12 to 18 months. And so I decided to leave it. And so I left it. And I waited 12 months, tasted it, wasn't really that much better. And I waited 18 months and I could definitely feel that the tannins had complexed out and there was that softening and velveting of the tannins, but there was no fruit flavor. And I put it into oak for 18 months. And I remember bottling this wine. I remember bottling it and thinking, am I doing the right thing here? Am I about to end up with pallets of wine that I can't sell because it's got no fruit flavor? It just had stemsy, skinsy sort of, just didn't have this grapefruit flavor at all. But I thought, I've got the bottles, already started, I'll do it. And I bottled it. And then about 12 months later in bottle, it was amazing. It was like this explosion of fruit from nowhere, really intense cassis, capsicum, tomato leaf, you know, those really typical cool climate Cabernet characters. And now I'm super excited about this wine because it's doing exactly what the French told me would happen. It's created a really fruity wine. And 2 years ago, I would have said that the fruit level would have dropped a lot more than it already has. And it hasn't. It's just hanging in there and hanging in there. It's got those nice velvety complex tannins. So in 50 years time, in theory, we can get back on Zoom and I can tell you whether this experiment worked or not. And it is an experiment. I still, to this day, have not met anyone else in Australia that's made a wine 18 months on the skins. You know, Wine Australia did this massive research project on post-ferment maceration, and that project went to 6 months. And that's because they went to the 3 month mark, they measured it, analyzed it, tasted it. They went to 4 months, measured, analyzed, tasted, no change. 5 months, no change. 6 months, no change. So they stopped the project. And after using this technique, I can tell you between 3 months and 12 months, nothing happened. Between 12 and 18, everything happened. So I don't know what happens then, but it definitely happens. And what do the French say? 12 to 18 months. So whatever's happening is happening. I don't know anyone that's done it from Australian fruit, so I don't know whether the result is going to be the same. But as it sits now, I'm really excited about this wine. It's still very much in that fruity spectrum, but it's a great match for roast lamb at the moment. But I expect that just is going to age and age really well. So I am really excited about that wine. So we've got one more to end on, and this is a really interesting one to finish up on. This is called 8,000 Vintages. So the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and it's dated 6000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. So that is some serious wine history going on there. If you are into history, there's a great book called Ancient Wine that talks about this, talks about how they prove the oldest record of winemaking. But it comes from this country called Georgia, from this little town that's just outside the capital, Tbilisi. I was lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. So I do 6 months Australia, 6 months Georgia for 7 years. And this is my homage to the history of wine and homage to Georgia. It's our Australian version of a really famous red wine style out of Georgia called Kinsmarauli. I should write that up. Kinsmarauli. Oh, whoops. Got to actually put the cursor in the right spot. That's how you spell it there. Very famous red style over there. I sell heaps of this to Russians and Eastern Europeans here in Australia because it is really true to style. When I was in Georgia in 2006, I think it was, Russia and Georgia had this little battle, and the Russians put an embargo on all imports from Georgia, and it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle Kinsmarauli across the border in school buses. So it's that famous over there. To describe it, for me, I always want to describe it as a Kinsmarauli because that's what it tastes like. But it kind of has like the depth and complexity and Christmas cake character like a tawny port, but then it has this beautiful fresh red fruit sort of character like a ruby port or a young red. And so, but it doesn't have the alcohol. It's only got that 12% alcohol. So I really love it. Beautifully with, like, you know, that American style, that really smoky style barbecue. It's a great match for that smoky style barbecue, or a mature cheddar, or a really dark chocolate. So it's a good match for all of those things. But a cool wine to end on as well. I'll put that up whilst we're chatting. So, guys, that's all the wines I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't bore you with my long stories of sheep. I would love you guys to follow us. I'll put some links up for you, but I would love you guys to follow us, of course, on Facebook and Instagram. These tastings are becoming the norm for us. They're becoming the main thing that we're going to do, and we're going to continue them. You know, the feedback has been amazing. We've just launched them over in America as well. So if you have American friends, please let them know. You can even join them if you don't mind getting up at 7 a.m. and doing a wine tasting. That's only if they're on the New York side, but if they're on the Californian side, it's not so bad. I think their 7 p.m. is about our lunchtime, so it's a bit more reasonable joining them if you're on the Californian side. We're about to launch maybe some museum tastings. We're getting up and going a sparkling wine tasting. So we're really going to keep going on these virtual wine tastings for quite some time now. So thanks for joining me. If you do buy something, if it works, I'll put a link up, and I'll also put some voucher codes up if I can get it to work. If you do end up heading out to the shop, there we go. Please, guys, do not get confused. You are going to end up in a bottle shop down the South Coast. We make good wines, but we have a terrible website. So we are using their website to process all our orders. So you are meant to be down in Vincentia. That's where you're meant to go, because we're using their website. So please don't get confused about that. And I put some voucher codes up there as well. So guys, thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're staying safe, and maybe one day you'll be able to cross borders or come and visit us. I am going to mute out, but I will leave my chat box open for a while. So if anyone wants to ask any questions or give any feedback, I'll definitely be on chat for a while. For those of you who've got friends here or want to jump online and talk to some people where you can see the videos, there's a link. Hang on, did I put it up there? Oh no, that's right. We had that little short out. So I will put another link up right now. I'll just get it for you. For a live or like a video session, and that way those of you who want to catch up on that can head to the video session, because I know a few people are here with groups of friends and that sort of thing. So there's that link there now for another Zoom session, which is live now. So you can jump on that and chat to your friends and try the other half of your wines if you didn't finish it all off now, and enjoy a bit more of a video interaction as well. So guys, I'll sign out. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and hopefully we'll see you here one day. So thanks very much, guys. I'll be here on chat for